Will be video 1 notes for the weekend of October 15th and 16th. We're picking up here with the national economy. We should have just covered commercial agriculture, and now we're picking up with cotton in the South. So we're talking about how, what's starting to happen here, especially up in these, northwest areas and even the South too. You're seeing more commercial farming happening, where you're having more markets being opened by railroads and canals and so forth, and allows people to get their products to more locations. So we're picking up today with cotton in the South. Throughout the 1800s, cotton was the South's principal cash crop. So when the cotton gin comes out in the 1790s, going to the 1800s, tobacco, indigo, all that stuff takes a back seat to cotton. Cotton becomes the dominant crop throughout the entire South and the principal cash crop. Most folks in the South who make any kind of money off farming are going to probably make it off cotton. Eli Whitney's cotton gin transformed the region because now cotton all of a sudden is profitable with the cotton gin. You can make it, you can mass produce it, and actually sell it, make money because you can now clean it easier. So it's going to be a lot cheaper than selling things like wool and so forth. Or you make a lot more money selling things like wool. So you can now easily separate the seeds. It's more profitable than anything like tobacco or indigo now, and that's why cotton becomes this big, massive cash crop for the South. Because of this, as Southerners begin to expand to new states like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and so forth, they need more slaves because cotton takes a lot of land to make a lot of cotton for a profit. And so if you have a lot of land, you got to have a lot of slaves to work as well. We will also begin to ship a lot of these crops overseas. So cotton will not just be big in America, it'll also be big in Europe eventually, and especially with Britain. Britain, like we said, has this big-time market over textiles, and so they're going to want American cotton. And so over time, Britain becomes our biggest buyer of cotton for the South, especially as we get closer and closer to the Civil War, where we're sending the majority of our cotton overseas to Britain because they're textile factories. Southern cotton also furnished the raw materials for manufacturing in the Northeast, as well as developing which helps develop national economic ties. So because our own manufacturing in America is mostly centered around clothing or textiles, like in New England, like Lowell, Massachusetts, and so forth, the North also becomes directly tied into cotton too. So as the South makes a lot of cotton, the North also needs that cotton to be able to produce their goods, which is one of the reasons why slavery becomes more and more complex. Because if you were to all of a sudden abolish slavery, it would mean a national economic downturn or big time recession or depression. So that's why slavery is becoming more and more complicated, because when the cotton gin comes out, slavery expands. It increases, as opposed to what Jefferson and Washington and those guys believed that it was going to decrease. And all of a sudden it increases, and it doesn't seem to be slowing down. All right, so that's the rest of this slide. So now we're moving to, on this slide, and I don't know how well you can see these charts and whatnot. You can see have a picture here of cotton production. You can see here on this map of America, this is what cotton production looks like in the 1820s. Yellow is where there is some, and then red is like where it's heavy. This is cotton production by 1860, where you can see it's greatly increased by that time period. And everywhere that's deeply red is going to also have a lot of slaves too. You notice that along the Mississippi, from Baton Rouge up New Orleans up all the way to Natchez, is one of the heaviest areas for plantations, especially cotton plantations, which is at that time one of the areas that had the most millionaires in the country, was that area too. You can see how cotton also becomes more valuable over time. This is value of cotton exports as a percentage. So 1800, cotton was only 7% of our export income. 1820, it's 32%. By 1840, it's 51%. And by 1860, when the Civil War breaks out, cotton makes up 57.5% of our export money. So cotton was a huge impact, not just for the South, but for the entire American economy. You can also see how slavery corresponds. Slavery was up here, less than 125,000 in America in 1790. Then it goes above 125,000 as cotton production comes up, and as cotton production goes up, so does slavery, and so on and so forth. So cotton, slavery, and institution, all these things are directly connected to each other. So make sure you kind of understand the data behind all this and how all these issues interconnect and relate to one another. All right, so now we're going to the effects of the market revolution. Okay, specialization on the farm, growth of cities, industrialization, and development of modern capitalism meant an end of self-sufficient households. So it starts to happen by the 18 teens, 20s, 30s, and going into the mid-century, moving away from subsistence farming, self-sufficient farming, away from that Jeffersonian ideal, and America's becoming more of a market economy, as we mentioned the other day. Because people are now beginning to specialize on farms, meaning they're only growing cotton. They're not growing things to live on. They're growing things just to sell, like cotton or wheat or whatever the case is. Cities are getting bigger because of factories, immigration. Cities are getting bigger. Industrialization. People begin to take on factory jobs as opposed to farming jobs as the century goes on and on. And you get more modern capitalism, meaning that you get more of a market type, supply and demand type based economy, other than the old farmer type economy what we had before. So we have more of a self-sufficient households and more interdependence. So before this, a lot of times farmers would basically make everything for themselves. They'd have to rely on very few people outside their own community. Now you're relying on people to bring you goods from across the country, from different regions. So you might only grow cotton, but now you got to rely on New England to provide you clothing. Or some other part of the country provides you food like wheat and so forth, or fruits or vegetables. So as what's also happening because of the market revolution here, you're also seeing the country becoming more interdependent. We can't just do things on our own like we once did before this. Not to say that everybody was totally isolated or did things on their own, but that was more the case before. For most Americans, the standard of living increases too. So north, south, west, whatever you're talking about, because of the market economy, you're seeing an increased standard of living, which means things are getting easier and things are getting cheaper, and it's easier to live and be successful in life for that time period anyway. But the fast-changing economy has problems too, which we're going to see that throughout this unit and other units in the future too. So now we're looking at women. There we go. So looking at women and their relationship with this market revolution. All right. So with more urban and industrial society, the nature of the women's roles changes. So the way women operate in society begins to change because of a market economy and because of a more industrial economy too. Many women no longer worked on farms with husbands. As we already saw, like in Lowell, you begin to hire a bunch of women that go out in these factories, and it becomes the norm. A lot of women are hired, just like men, into factories, and that begins to change their role in society. And if they're working, they're not at home, they're not being the housewife or mom all the time if they're in a factory necessarily. So in cities, women had two choices. Either you were domestic or you taught. So once you begin to see people moving to cities off the farms, women, if they didn't work in a factory, they basically had two choices. You could be a domestic worker, meaning you could work in a house, being a maid or being some kind of laundry keeper, whatever the case is, nanny, or you could be a teacher, because now you don't rely on the farm anymore to be your main way of life. So in cities, women had two choices, being domestics or teaching, which become like women-type jobs, being maids, being teachers, and so forth. The Lowell-type jobs are few. Even though Lowell hired a bunch of women, it wasn't the norm yet. So 1820s, 1830s, there's not a lot of factories hiring women quite yet. Most working women were single. So you don't see a lot of married women working because there's kind of a stigma behind it that if you're a woman working in a factory, you might have already been tainted, or you might have already had relations with someone. So most working women were single, and plus, even if you didn't have that reputation, once you got married, a lot of times you were expected to be the housewife, to not work in that job anymore. Most women who got married left the job and went to work at home, and so didn't pursue a lifelong career of doing really anything except being a mom and wife. Women were slowly getting more control of their lives too, so slowly but surely women are getting more say in legal means and so forth. They're getting more legal power. Arranged marriages were less common. It might seem kind of weird, but a lot of marriages back in those days were not for love. Before this, especially back towards colonial period and shortly after. A lot of times it's kind of what families wanted, who they wanted you to get married to, or if a guy came and asked you for marriage, you didn't necessarily marry somebody that you knew for forever and knew for a lifelong time and so forth. But fortunately, with women becoming more prominent in society, you're seeing less marriages based on arrangement and more marriages based on love as a result of industrialization, manufacturing, and so forth. People are also having fewer children too. If you're not working on a farm, you don't need 10 children because someone on a farm needs a bunch of kids that have farm hands. But if you live in a city and you're making little money, you don't need to have 8 children. So people begin to have fewer children, having that 1 to 2 or 3 children in their lifetime. So these are some ways that women's lives are changing. There's still lots of legal restrictions. It's still very difficult for women to get divorced. There's still very little women can do in terms of property ownership in general, but things are slightly getting better for women in general for society. Then we look at economic and social mobility. Real wages improved for most urban workers, but the gap between the wealthy and very poor increased. So over time, wages do slowly increase for workers, but what the owners, the elites make versus what the workers make, the gap gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. Because again, there's nothing to stop this from happening. There's no laws preventing factories from making all kinds of profits off their workers. So this gap just basically keeps increasing over time. So people became, even though the wages might have gone up, people still got poor because of the way that the people at the top kept a lot of money, kept a lot of their earnings and profits and so forth. And so people do get poorer over time, especially once you have immigrants come to the country too. Social mobility did occur from one generation to the next, meaning like, you might make it so far, but your kids typically did better than you did, and their kids did better than they did. So what you do see happen in America because of the industrialization is that each generation, they get a little bit better way of life. That's kind of what everybody's goal is even now, is that you do better than your parents, and that you want your kids to do better than you did, and then keeps progressing more and more and more. And no matter what, our economic opportunities were greater than what was in Europe. So if you compare us to Europe, even though we might have had some harsh factory conditions and sometimes things weren't always the best, compared to Europe, our society, as far as social mobility goes and as far as earning wages, was still leaps and bounds better than what you found in Europe a lot of times, because at least there's more opportunities here to do a lot more. So next we're going to look at slavery here. And we're going to look at slavery a lot more at the end of this unit because there's a whole chapter on it, chapter 16, which you're going to read. But we're just going to touch on it briefly here. At the beginning of the 1800s, there were many people who felt slavery would gradually disappear. We've said this repeatedly, that guys like Jefferson felt like slavery was on the decline, that it would be gone in the next 20, 30 years. Economically, it became unfeasible due to exhausted soil and constitutional ban by the international trade. So another reason why they thought it was going to decline, because all the soil butchery that was going on the East Coast for over a century, and then you get on top of that the constitutional slave ban that takes place in 1808. So it made sense. A lot of those people in that time period felt like slavery was going to decline. But the cotton industry picked up at the same time, and so once the cotton gin comes out and cotton farming becomes big, it does the exact opposite. Slavery becomes bigger and more expansive, and then it's going to expand. I don't know what you can see this map. It's going to expand all across this region. And this map kind of shows you that some of the things we've been talking about. It shows you Western settlement based on 1800, 1820. You can see most of the areas that people are moving towards in this time period are the western, they're west for that time, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. You see people going deeper into Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, areas around rivers, a lot of cotton production down here. And of course, there's going to be these guys are going to be farmers out here too, at least at first, before you have mass industrialization. You can also see some images here, women working in factories, people working in factories. In general, kind of how factory work was like back in those days. These are some different images, and so forth. All right. So what we're going to do now is kind of break down each section and see how each section was different from one another, and how each section had its own specializations and did different things. So first, we're going to look at the North, and pretty much. We're looking at the North in general, but we're going to look at the Northeast first, and then we're going to look at the Northwest second. So we're looking at the Northeast, which is where more of the manufacturing takes place in general. So the North contained two parts. The Northeast, which was like New England and the Atlantic states. Then you had the Old Northwest, which were like Ohio to Minnesota, all those Illinois, Indiana areas, all that territory. They were brought together by improved transportation, as we said, canals, turnpikes, and later railways. The North was more connected. Even though they kind of did different things, they're much more interconnected and have more of a market because of those improved transportation. And because of a high rate of economic growth based on commercial farming and industrial innovation. So the Northeast does a lot of industrial innovation. The Northwest does a lot of commercial farming, like wheat and so forth. So the two do become pretty connected, going back and forth, back and forth. This also becomes the most populated section of the country. So the North, everything from New York, Boston, over to eventually Chicago, all that area is going to become the most populated areas, because when immigrants come to this country, they go work in cities. And same thing for people who don't make it as farmers, they go work in cities. So the South remains a majority farming community or farming region through the Civil War. All right, so we're looking at, we'll take a break there and go to the next video, but we're going to start next with the industrial Northeast.